The dust kicked up by the old pickup truck settled slowly on Main Street as Ayani stepped out, her boots connecting with the cracked asphalt of Cedar Falls, Arizona. 7 years had passed since she'd last seen this place, but the town looked frozen in time. The same weathered storefronts, the same judgmental stares from behind tinted windows, the same suffocating silence that had once consumed her childhood. At 23, Ayani carried herself differently now. Her long black hair was braided with traditional Apache beads her grandmother had given her, and her dark eyes held a quiet intensity that made people look away. She wore simple jeans and a denim jacket, but there was something in her posture, straight-backed, purposeful, that announced she wasn't the scared 16-year-old who had fled this town in the back of a social worker's car. The memory hit her as she stood there, her mother, Maria, lying unconscious in the hospital bed, machines beeping around her broken body. The police report that labeled it a random assault. The whispered conversations that stopped when Ayani entered rooms. The way the investigation quietly died, filed away like so many other cases involving Native women. "Well, I'll be damned," came a voice from across the street. Sheriff Tom Bradley stepped out of the diner, his badge catching the afternoon sun. He'd gained weight over the years, his uniform straining against his belly, but his eyes held the same dismissive coldness Ayani remembered. "Ayani Yazi, didn't expect to see you back here." Ayani turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Sheriff Bradley. You visiting family?" he asked, crossing the street with deliberate slowness. "Thought most of your people had moved on from around here." The casual racism in his words was delivered with the same tone he might use to comment on the weather. Ayani had grown up hearing it, the subtle and not so subtle reminders that she didn't belong, that her people were somehow less than the white families who'd claimed this land generations ago. "I'm not visiting," Ayani said quietly. "I'm here to stay." Sheriff Bradley's eyebrows rose. "That's so? Well, just remember this is a peaceful town. We like to keep it that way." As he walked away, Ayani felt the familiar weight of being watched. In the diner windows, at the gas station, from behind curtains in the houses lining the street, she could feel their stares, their whispered speculation about why the Apache girl had come back. But Ayani wasn't the broken teenager who had left. The years away had changed her. She'd spent time with her grandmother on the reservation, learning the old stories, the old ways of seeking justice. She'd gotten her degree in social work, specializing in cases involving missing and murdered indigenous women. She'd learned that silence was often the enemy's greatest weapon, and she'd made a promise to her mother, who still lived in a care facility in Phoenix, her mind forever trapped in the fog of traumatic brain injury. Maria would never be whole again, but her daughter could be the voice she'd lost that terrible night 7 years ago. As the sun began to set behind the desert mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Ayani walked slowly down Main Street. She stopped in front of the old community center, a building that had stood empty since budget cuts closed it down 5 years ago. The windows were boarded up and weeds grew through cracks in the sidewalk. This was where she would begin. The next morning, Ayani stood in the office of Mayor Janet Hoffman, a thin woman in her 60s, whose nervous energy filled the small space. The mayor's hands fluttered around stacks of papers as she tried to process what Ayani was proposing. "You want to buy the community center?" Mayor Hoffman asked, her voice uncertain. "But it's been closed for years. The roof leaks, the heating system doesn't work, and—" "I'm aware of its condition," Ayani interrupted gently. "I'm prepared to pay for renovations." The mayor's confusion was evident. Like everyone else in Cedar Falls, she remembered Ayani as the poor Apache girl whose mother cleaned houses and worked double shifts at the truck stop diner. The idea that she now had money, real money, didn't fit the narrative they'd constructed about her family. What they didn't know was that Ayani's grandfather, Thomas Yazi, had been a shrewd businessman who'd invested in mineral rights on reservation land decades ago. When he passed 2 years ago, he'd left everything to his granddaughter, the one person in the family who'd finished college, the one who'd promised to use any resources she gained to help their people. "I'll need to see proof of funds," the mayor said, still skeptical. Ayani slid a bank statement across the desk. The mayor's eyes widened as she saw the balance, enough to buy and renovate the building several times over. What do you plan to use it for?" Mayor Hoffman asked. "A resource center," Ayani said. "Legal aid, social services, support groups. For anyone who needs help but doesn't know where to find it." The mayor's expression shifted as she began to understand the implications. Cedar Falls was a town that survived on not asking questions, on letting certain things slide. A resource center meant lawyers, advocacy groups, people who specialized in digging up the truth. "I'm not sure the town would support something like that," the mayor said carefully. "The town doesn't need to support it," Ayani replied. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm following proper legal channels to purchase and renovate a building, unless there's a legal reason I can't." Mayor Hoffman shuffled through papers, clearly uncomfortable. No legal reason, it's just, well, you have to understand, this community has a certain way of doing things." "I understand perfectly," Ayani said, standing. "That's exactly why this center is needed." As Ayani left City Hall, she noticed the sheriff's patrol car parked across the street. Bradley was inside, talking on his radio, his eyes fixed on her. She walked past without acknowledgement, but she could feel his attention like a weight on her shoulders. By afternoon, word of Ayani's plans had spread through town like wildfire. At the grocery store, conversation stopped when she entered. At the gas station, the attendant avoided eye contact. The invisible network of gossip that kept small towns running was working overtime, and Ayani was at the center of it all. She drove out to the Riverside Trailer Park, a collection of aging mobile homes where many of the town's working poor lived. This was where James Morrison had lived, the man who'd been briefly questioned about her mother's attack before the investigation stalled. His trailer still sat at the end of the gravel road, though neighbors whispered that he'd left town years ago. Knocking on doors, Ayani introduced herself to the residents. Many remembered her mother, remembered the attack, remembered how quickly everyone had been told to forget about it. But they also remembered being ignored by authorities, being treated as unreliable witnesses because of their economic status. "Your mama was good people," said Rosa Martinez, an elderly woman who'd lived in the park for decades. "She didn't deserve what happened. None of us did." "None of us?" Ayani asked. Rosa's weathered face tightened. "There were others, Mija. Before your mama, after your mama. Women who didn't matter to people in town, but they mattered to us." As the sun set on her second day back in Cedar Falls, Ayani sat in her truck outside the empty community center, looking at the building that would become something the town had never seen before, a place where silence was not an option, where the forgotten would have voices, where the truth could finally be spoken without fear. She thought about her mother, about the promise she'd made, and about the ripples her presence was already creating in this town's carefully maintained facade of peace. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Within 2 weeks, Ayani had contractors working on the community center. The sound of hammers and power tools echoed down Main Street from dawn to dusk, a constant reminder to the townspeople that change was coming whether they wanted it or not. The old Cedar Falls Community Center sign had been replaced with a new one, 4 Directions Resource Center. Ayani had chosen the name carefully. In Apache tradition, the 4 directions represented completeness, balance, and the interconnection of all life. It was a message to her people that this was a place where their culture would be respected, and a message to the town that this center would serve everyone, regardless of background. The renovations revealed more than just structural problems. When workers tore down a wall in the basement, they found a box of old police files that had been stored and forgotten. Among them was a thick folder labeled Unsolved Cases 1998-2015. And Maria Yazzi's assault case was just one of many involving Native American women from the area. Ayani spread the files across a table in her temporary office, her hands shaking slightly as she read report after report of dismissed investigations, lost evidence, and witnesses who'd never been interviewed. The pattern was clear and devastating, a systematic failure to investigate crimes against indigenous women, a culture of willful blindness that allowed predators to operate with impunity. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "You should leave town." Some secrets are better left buried. Instead of fear, Ayani felt a familiar stirring of determination. The same feeling she'd had as a child when bullies at school thought they could intimidate her with threats. Her grandmother had taught her that fear was just energy that could be transformed into power if you knew how to channel it. The next morning, she received her first visitor at the center. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic anthropologist from the State University, had driven 3 hours after hearing about Ayani's discovery. "These files," Dr. Chen said, studying the documents, "they represent a clear pattern of investigative failures. If you're willing, I'd like to bring a team here to review all of these cases, pro bono." "Why would you do that?" Ayani asked. "Because I specialize in cold cases involving Native women," Dr. Chen replied. "And because what happened here isn't unique. It's happening in towns across the country, but most people don't have the resources or determination to fight it." As word spread about Dr. Chen's involvement, other experts began reaching out. A team of lawyers from a civil rights organization in Phoenix, a documentary filmmaker who'd been following the crisis of missing and murdered indigenous women, a retired FBI profiler who specialized in serial crimes. Sheriff Bradley visited the center that afternoon, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "You're stirring up trouble," he told Ayani, "bringing in outsiders, making accusations about how this department handles investigations." "I haven't made any accusations," Ayani replied calmly. "I've simply shared information that was already in public files." "Those files were stored here by mistake," Bradley said. "They should have been returned to the department years ago." Then you should have kept better track of your evidence," Ayani said. "But since they were abandoned here, they're now part of this building's contents." Bradley's face reddened. "You think you're smart, don't you? Coming back here with your college degree and your big city lawyers. But this is still my town, and I won't have some troublemaker destroying the peace we've worked hard to maintain." "Peace for whom?" Ayani asked. "Because it wasn't peaceful for my mother. It wasn't peaceful for the other women whose cases were ignored. And it won't be peaceful for future victims if nothing changes." After Bradley left, Ayani found herself thinking about her grandmother's stories of resistance. How Apache women had always been warriors, not just in battle, but in protecting their communities, in speaking truth even when it was dangerous. That evening, she received her first supportive visitor. Elena Rodriguez, a middle-aged woman who worked as a school secretary, knocked hesitantly on the center's door. "I heard what you're doing," Elena said quietly. "My daughter, she was attacked 5 years ago, walking home from work. The police said there wasn't enough evidence, that she probably misidentified her attacker, but I know she didn't, and I know she wasn't the only one." "Will you tell me about it?" Ayani asked. As Elena shared her story, Ayani realized that the forgotten files were just the beginning. The real evidence was in the memories and experiences of women who'd never been properly heard, whose voices had been systematically silenced by a system that found it easier to ignore than to investigate. By the end of the week, Ayani had heard from 12 women and family members, each with stories that followed the same pattern. Attacks that were minimally investigated, evidence that was lost or ignored. A consistent message that they should move on and forget. But Ayani wasn't interested in forgetting. She was interested in remembering and in making sure the whole world remembered with her. 3 months after her return to Cedar Falls, Ayani stood before a packed room in the newly renovated Four Directions Resource Center. News crews from Phoenix, Tucson, and Albuquerque had set up cameras, their lights casting harsh shadows on the faces of townspeople who'd never expected their small community to become the center of a national conversation about justice. The investigation led by Dr. Chen's team had uncovered a web of connected crimes spanning nearly 2 decades. DNA evidence that had been improperly stored was retested with modern techniques. Witnesses who'd been dismissed or ignored were finally interviewed properly. Digital forensics experts had recovered deleted files from old police computers. The results were devastating and undeniable. James Morrison, the man who'd been briefly questioned about Maria Yaz's attack, had fled Cedar Falls not because he was innocent, but because Sheriff Bradley had warned him that investigators were getting too close. Morrison was now in custody in Nevada, where he'd been arrested for a similar assault. DNA evidence linked him not only to Maria's attack, but to 5 other cases in the Cedar Falls area. But Morrison was just the beginning. The investigation had revealed that he'd been part of a larger network of men who targeted Indigenous women specifically because they knew their crimes would be ignored or minimally investigated. Some were local men in positions of power, others were drifters who'd learned that certain towns were safe hunting grounds. Sheriff Bradley himself was now under investigation for obstruction of justice and civil rights violations. The pattern of investigative failures in cases involving Native women was so consistent and deliberate that federal prosecutors were treating it as a criminal conspiracy. As Ayani looked out at the crowd, she saw faces she recognized from her childhood, some supportive, some hostile, many simply stunned by the revelations of the past months. In the front row sat her mother, brought from Phoenix in a special medical transport. Maria's eyes were clearer today than they'd been in years, as if some part of her understood that this moment was important. 7 years ago, Ayani began, her voice steady and clear, each word carefully measured and deliberate as she stood behind the makeshift podium in the cramped community center. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting uneven shadows across her weathered face, a face that bore the weight of years spent fighting battles in courtrooms far from home. My mother was brutally attacked on her way home from work. She was found beaten unconscious in an alley 3 blocks from here, that narrow passage between Miller's hardware store and the old Sinclair gas station that half of you walk past every day without a second thought. Her dark eyes swept across the room, taking in every face, every expression, every subtle shift in posture. The crowd was larger than she'd expected. Nearly 100 people crammed into folding chairs that had seen better days, some standing along the walls, others spilling out into the hallway. The air was thick with tension and the lingering scent of burnt coffee from the ancient percolator in the corner. Her skull was fractured in 3 places, Ayani continued, her voice never wavering despite the emotional weight of her words. The doctors said she was lucky to survive, but luck is a relative term when you spend the next 7 years unable to recognize your own daughter half the time, when simple words become mountains too steep to climb, when the vibrant woman who raised me became a shadow of herself. She paused, her gaze finding and holding Sheriff Bradley's hostile stare. He sat rigidly in the back row, his uniform pressed to military precision, his arms crossed defensively across his barrel chest. His weathered face was set in the same expression of skeptical dismissal he'd worn 7 years ago when he'd closed her mother's case with barely a shrug. "The police called it random violence," she said, her tone sharpening with barely contained anger. "A case of wrong place, wrong time, bad luck in a good town. Sheriff Bradley here filed it away after a few weeks of what I can only generously call minimal investigation. 3 witness interviews, no follow-up on the suspicious vehicle misses. Chen reported seeing, no canvassing of nearby businesses for security footage that might have existed." Bradley's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his pale blue eyes never leaving her face. "But it wasn't random," Ayani continued, her voice growing stronger, more commanding. "It was part of a carefully orchestrated pattern of violence against indigenous women that this community, this entire community, chose to ignore. Not because you didn't know it was happening. Not because the signs weren't there, but because it was easier, more comfortable, less complicated to look away than to confront the uncomfortable truth that monsters were operating in your midst, hiding behind familiar faces and friendly smiles." The murmurs that rippled through the crowd were like disturbed water, starting small and growing into waves of uncomfortable recognition. Some people shifted in their metal folding chairs, the scraping sound echoing off the water-stained walls. Others stared down at their hands, suddenly fascinated by their own fingernails. Mrs. Patterson from the post office dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, while her husband Jim looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. "I didn't come back here for revenge," Ayani continued, her voice taking on a tone of weary determination. "God knows I had opportunities for that. 7 years of law school debt and anger can fuel a lot of destructive impulses. But revenge is just another form of silence, another way of letting the real problems fester in the dark. I came back because silence is what allowed these crimes to continue. Every time someone said, 'Let sleeping dogs lie,' or 'Don't stir up trouble,' or 'That's just how things are around here,' they were giving explicit permission for more women to be hurt, more families to be destroyed, more lives to be discarded like yesterday's newspaper." She gestured toward the wall behind her, where dozens of photographs were displayed. Not the sanitized school pictures or family portraits that usually accompanied victim stories, but candid shots that captured life and personality. Women laughing at birthday parties, graduation ceremonies, holding babies, working at jobs, living full lives before they became statistics. "These women had names," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, forcing the room to lean in and listen. "Marie Yazzie, my mother, who worked double shifts at Henderson's Diner to put me through college, who never missed one of my basketball games even when her feet were swollen from standing all day. Jennifer Crow Feather, 19 years old, who wanted to be a veterinarian and volunteer at the animal shelter every weekend until she vanished walking home from her job at the grocery store." She pointed to each photograph as she spoke, her finger tracing invisible lines between faces and stories. Carmen Santos, who raised 4 children alone after her husband died in Afghanistan, who made the best tamales in 3 counties and never charged the elderly customers full price. Rosa Maria Delgado, a grandmother of 7 who was found beaten to death in her own garden, still clutching the tomatoes she'd been picking for dinner. Sarah Littlehorse, a teacher at the elementary school who stayed after hours to tutor struggling students, who disappeared on a Tuesday afternoon and whose body was found 3 months later in a ravine 20 miles from here. Her voice grew stronger with each name, each story, each life reclaimed from anonymity. They had families who loved them fiercely. They had dreams that reached beyond the boundaries of this town. Carmen was saving money to visit her sister in San Antonio. Sarah was taking night classes to get her master's degree. Jennifer had been accepted to veterinary school in Colorado. They had hopes that tomorrow would be better than today, that their children would have opportunities they never had, that justice existed somewhere in this world. They weren't statistics or acceptable losses in someone's convenient definition of keeping the peace. They were human beings who deserved to live full lives, to grow old, to see their grandchildren, to die peacefully in their beds surrounded by love, instead of alone and afraid in dark places. Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic anthropologist who'd been working pro bono on the cold cases, stepped forward to present the technical findings. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and spread out the evidence charts on a table that wobbled despite the folded napkin someone had shoved under one leg. "The bone analysis reveals consistent patterns of trauma," she began, her scientific training keeping her voice steady even as her heart raced. "Blunt force injuries to the skull, defensive wounds on forearms and hands, evidence of sexual assault in several cases. The similarities are too numerous and too specific to be coincidental. We're looking at the work of one individual, possibly two working together, operating in this area for at least a decade. But it was the personal testimonies that followed that hit the hardest, that cut through the comfortable distance of forensic evidence and statistical analysis like knives through paper." Elena Rodriguez approached the microphone with halting steps, her arthritic hands gripping her wooden cane so tightly her knuckles were white against her brown skin. She was 83 years old, a woman who'd survived the Depression, World War II, and the death of 2 husbands, but speaking publicly about her daughter's attack still made her voice shake like autumn leaves. "My Isabella," she began in accented English, then switched to Spanish for a moment before catching herself. "My daughter, she was 26 when it happened. Beautiful girl, smart like her grandmother, working at the bank, engaged to a good man from Tucson. She was walking to her car after evening mass at St. Catherine's. You all know the church. You've all walked that same parking lot 100 times when someone grabbed her from behind." Elena's voice broke, and she had to pause to collect herself, wiping tears with a handkerchief that had belonged to her own mother. "The doctor said she would recover, and her body did heal mostly, but she never came back, not really. She broke off her engagement, quit her job, moved to Phoenix where nobody knew what happened to her. She calls me once a week, but she never comes home. Never. Because this place holds too much fear, too much pain, too many memories of being told by people in uniform that what happened to her wasn't important enough to investigate properly." Rosa Martinez, a woman in her 50s, whose prematurely gray hair spoke of too many sleepless nights and too much worry, stepped up next. Her hands shook as she adjusted the microphone, the feedback screech making several people wince. At a community meeting, Rosa spoke out about the many young women from Riverside Park who had vanished over the years. Lisa Morningstar, Angela Redhawk, Crystal Begay, cases repeatedly dismissed by police as runaways. Her voice, filled with long-suppressed anger, was soon joined by others. Patricia Clearwater shared how her granddaughter had been stalked. James Whitehorse described finding his sister's belongings along a highway, and Mary Sandoval recalled ignored fears voiced by her former students. Together, their testimonies painted a damning picture of systemic neglect toward Indigenous women. Cases deprioritized, families disregarded, and justice denied. The most powerful moment came when Maria Yazzie, still recovering from a stroke caused by her own assault, was wheeled to the front. With great effort, she managed to say, "Thank you for not letting them forget, for making them see," moving the entire room to tears, including the wife of disgraced Sheriff Bradley. As the event ended, instead of dispersing, the community lingered, talking, grieving, and for the first time, asking the right questions. Mrs. Henderson, Maria's former employer, tearfully confessed that she had noticed Maria's fear before her attack, but had said nothing. Ayani reassured her it wasn't too late to help, and invited her to support the newly founded resource center. Determined to be part of the change, Mrs. Henderson pledged her support. Ayani encouraged her to start by organizing a network of safe spaces and improving community police communication. In the following weeks, real change took hold. The FBI reopened cases with long-ignored evidence and witness accounts, leading to multiple arrests: a long-haul trucker preying on women along highways, a respected businessman hiding a violent past, and 2 local men who had stalked and targeted indigenous women using their knowledge of the area and their positions of trust. Cedar Falls was no longer silent, and justice, long delayed, had finally begun to arrive. After Sheriff Bradley was removed and prosecuted for obstructing justice and negligence, Dr. Emma Yazzie, a Native American woman with 2 decades of law enforcement experience, was elected as the new sheriff. Her first act was to reopen every unsolved case involving indigenous women from the past 15 years. Meanwhile, Ayani's vision came to life in the 4 Directions Resource Center, a place offering real support: legal aid, counseling, advocacy, and investigation. Within 6 months, the center had handled over 200 cases and inspired similar initiatives across the Southwest. Ayani's return home had sparked a wider movement. When she received a heartfelt letter from a young Apache woman in Montana facing similar injustice, Ayani knew the fight was no longer just local. It was national, generational, and growing. As she responded with guidance and encouragement, Ayani reflected on the resilience of her ancestors. Change, she realized, required more than laws. It required courage, light in the darkness, and a refusal to stay silent. The work of justice had begun, and the silence that once smothered her community was broken, for good.